So what's role at Xero?
Head of enterprise in the US. I run the go-to-market sales teams for Xero that looks after top 300 firms, plus any large franchises.
So with a top 300 firm, their clients are normally a lot bigger, so they probably don't fit on Xero.
Yeah. And so they're usually leveraging NetSuite, some SAP and Oracle, Intact. We got a fairly good amount of companies that are publicly listed that are operating on Xero.
Yeah, I would think that when you're targeting those bigger firms, that you're going after the younger leadership in those firms. You differentiate yourself between QuickBooks enough with the younger leadership.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not always the younger folks that follow, believe it or not.
I believe it.
And I saw this even when I was in practice. Like, you never really know who the change agent's going to be. It's a pretty common thing.
It's mindset, not an age. Yeah, you got to find the people with the right mindset.
Why don't you let David answer the question? This is typical. Typical of what happens.
I'm thinking out loud here. I'm thinking about it with him. Does he know? He knows the answer. Then this is what he does for a living.
I've just always wondered why Xero doesn't focus on firms like ours. That it seems like you could get a lot like lower down, not the 1 to 2 person, but the 10 to 20 person firm.
They got you.
Yeah.
How many do you know outside of you?
I can look at the Xero list. There's not a lot of gold partners. And I talked to a bunch of other firms my size, and they don't use Xero.
Yep. Yeah. And I think part of it has to do with where we are in the market here. And if you think about the firms that are out there that have the ability to move or change or pivot quicker and easier, they're not the larger firms. Yeah, that's why my team initially got established, is that when you're talking about a really big ship that needs to change or move, like it takes a lot of legwork to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of time, I'm sure. It takes a lot of time.
Yep.
All right, those are my only preliminary questions.
Those are the prelim questions?
I would think, though, an industry that's ripe for change is the one that has the most inertia, and ours does.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
Our industry is ripe for change. Awesome. Welcome, everybody, and every listener that might be with us for the first time to the Sons of CPAs with your co-host, Scott Scarano.
You want me to say my name? We haven't worked on the intro yet, David.
We have no intro. Let's just keep.
We have a special guest, David Emmerman. He just told me his title. I totally forgot it.
Why don't I test this? This is what I wrote on a HomePod mini instruction booklet with a pen.
I'm surprised you know how to write.
I don't know how to read. Apparently, I can't read this. 2 Jewish white dudes.
Okay.
$5 million in revenue and about 45 employees, repping the Carolinas. Both our fathers were CPAs. We want to question the industry norms and ask unreasonable questions with awesome people in this space.
That's good. I should have interrupted you. That's my bad. We've got David here.
Hey, everybody.
Now working
Emmerman,
100%
CPA.
Xero. Early Xero adopter in the public space, and now works for Xero.
We love Xero here.
That's pretty cool. So let's start from an early David. How did you get into accounting?
Wait, first, David, are you CPA?
No, I'm in EA.
You're EA. Okay, so am I. Yeah, let's talk about EAs. EAs. All right, so we can all. Was your father a CPA?
No, but he was in public accounting for my entire career.
Sons of Public Accounting.
Oh yeah. So how'd you get into accounting?
So I was born into it. Both my parents had practices. My father had a practice. My mother had a practice.
You were born into it, but then you went to Xero.
Were they? Were they competing practices? Were they arch enemies?
No, they shared some resources, but they didn't operate together. And they serviced different types of practices. My mother had really a straight up tax practice, just worked during tax season. And then my father had an ongoing accounting and tax practice, primarily operating in tax. So I spent about, 23 years trying to run away from it.
You can't. I tried to.
It's funny how that worked out, right? Oops, sorry. We got my dog, my puppy.
I was wondering what you were doing. I wasn't going to say anything since it's a podcast, but I love it.
Introduce the puppy.
Oh yeah, I've got a 90-pound Newfoundland puppy named Sophie.
Oh wow.
I like dogs on the other side of a screen.
She's only 9 months old, so she will be joining us today.
So how big do they get?
She'll get to about 120 pounds. Yeah. She doesn't realize she's 90 pounds. So back to early days. So ran away from accounting as long as I possibly could, went to school, came out, actually went into financial services.
So financial services means investment advising?
Yep. Insurance, investment advisory work. And I just didn't have a passion for that industry. Started working with my father's clients. And after about a year, he said to me, you need to start working in the practice. So I'll start working in the practice. And I actually took an H&R Block tax course way back when. Went back to school at LIU for accounting and spent the next 19 years working in the practice. When I came back to Long Island, there was this master plan of my father retiring about 3 years later. That's what he did. I think the writing was on the wall there.
The hero's journey again.
So he was like, go back to school so that you can take over the practice, basically.
Oh, yeah. This guy had plans. He was ready to go. Almost 10 years. He came up and back from Florida every other week or every couple of weeks to go sit down with his clients. And at that point, he was pretty much retired anyways and just enjoyed spending time with the people. He grew up in that practice and had serviced these folks for 30 plus years. They were like his family.
Yeah.
So he was a snowbird.
Snowbird, except for during taxes when he'd run back up here. And then my accounting journey kind of came from there. And the practice grew. We liked buying other practices.
When you started, what year was that?
2002.
So 2002.
Did you not just listen to what he said?
I didn't know if there's any partners involved or anything at
Yeah.
that point.
So there is a partner. So I had a lifelong friend I grew up with. His name's Kevin, who was in the military, went back to school for accounting. He was working for a CPA pretty local to where I live here. And we saw the opportunity to steal Kevin away and actually made him a partner right around the same time that my father decided that he was retiring. It was maybe like a 2-year gap in there. So about 2004, that was done. Kevin and I were taking over the practice.
What size is the practice at that point?
It was about 10 by 10. We had 2 locations. We had 10 staff, and we were serving 3,000 tax returns, somewhere in that range, and then providing accounting services.
For businesses?
That was
individuals too.
Yeah.
So what made you want to go out and buy other practices?
I wanted to grow. I saw a couple different pathways to growth. One of the easiest one was to buy the competitors that were nearby. Over the course of 9 years, we did about 14 deals, most of which were done towards the tail end of my career in public practice. Part of it was that early days when we were doing these deals, finding the right deal that made sense was difficult. They didn't come up all the time. If they did come up, you would scramble to get it done at any cost. And then
what was it you were looking for though? When you're talking about deals, like what was the criteria that made a good deal?
Yeah, so early days, a lot of it was geographically driven. So how many practices were coming up for sale in Long Island, which is where I grew up? There just weren't that many that were in a gross receipt range that we could afford. The challenge with buying practices was that it's very capital intensive and it's very change management heavy. And I think some of the challenges that we had earlier days was finding the right practice fit for what we wanted to take on.
Mm-hmm.
And
does that mean staff or type of client or?
Originally, it was type of service and size. Staff was always important. As we started to grow, staff became immensely important. I'll never forget, in our heyday, being able to top out around 1,000 returns per person was just insanity.
1,000 returns is insane.
It was, yeah, and we ran a really tight process that was very streamlined, and there was always those hiccups that came up.
What was the average price per return? If you're doing 1,000 returns, how much is it average?
The individual returns originally maybe $200.
Okay.
And then the business returns were all over the place. Most of it based on historical numbers and legacy numbers that we had to go in there and try and change.
It's hard to change that stuff. I had to deal with that too. It's tough.
Yeah, that's an insane amount of tax returns. Even that's insane.
Early days, my father figured out that if you ran a 45-minute appointment, you would pick up an extra 2 or 3 appointments per day. So if you were working a 10-hour time block, you could pick up extra returns if you chunked down to that 45-minute appointment instead of an hour, and then just only had a couple of breaks throughout the day. And then when we used to do this at full speed, like coming through the months of February, end of mid-January, let's say through February, like I would take one day off like every 2 to 3 weeks and just grind through it. Once you get down to the end of that, you're exhausted. You walk out.
That's not sustainable.
Yeah, how do you live like that?
How many, what was the staff turnover for that?
So we didn't turn staff over. That was the interesting part. And that kind of volume was.
Is that because you took the whole burden on yourself? You're doing most of the work.
Yeah, they didn't quite do the volume that Kevin and I were able to do.
Part of it is like they know once April 15th hits, like the rest of the year is not so bad. So like you cram it, the weather sucks in Long Island at that time. What else are you going to do for 3 months? It sucks.
Looking at the silver lining on it, I'm looking at how horrible it is. It sounds like there's a forest fire there that I'm trying to put out.
But how you did it though, because we still do it in our practice very similar as far as meeting with the client and doing the tax return while they're there. Sounds like that's what you did. So you can do a lot more.
20 years later,
now, I don't
still
do
doing the same thing.
I don't meet with 12 people a day, 7 days a week. I normally do 4 a day. So yeah. A little bit more spread out, but I can definitely, the process, you can do a lot of returns that way because they're there. You have any questions, you get them done. It's like the H&R Block model, but you're doing it with the CPA, and then you can provide some advice and planning while you're sitting there.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were in the groove, right? Like probably second, third week of February, to get through a tax return and get everything entered and get it completed to the point where it was, let's say, 90%, that doesn't take that long. It's all discovery and conversation that you have at the beginning and at the end and what happens in the middle. That was the real technique. Having a conversation that would start to spur other conversations. That's what drove a lot of the value, because we would dig into things and we would talk about things, and you get to know these folks year after year. And you would always find out something that would trigger some sort of thought within the tax return. Oh, did you guys get that new car? How's the house doing? And it's interesting when I think back to it, I don't think that as accountants, we really reflect enough on where we've been and the impact that we've had with our customers. I saw a lot of folks that never would have had their first homes if we hadn't pushed them into it.
Yeah, you provide a lot of value. So why do you think that so many firms don't do that with their tax returns?
So this to me is like a analogy of a sprint. The tax return is a sprint, and everything you're doing before it is stretching, preparing. Otherwise, if you just sprint your way through every return, you're not getting that chance to rebound and recover.
The conversations, they were the sprint, but they were also the value. So we had work that was getting prepped in advance. So that would be the stretching that was happening in advance. We still have the same conversations though.
But like you said, what you're doing while you're having that meeting, you learn how to do the tax return and talk with the client at the same time and ask the questions you need to ask to find out all the stuff that they did in the previous year that could affect their tax return. So why do you, I don't understand why other firms don't embrace this model.
Well, Dave, do you still embrace this model? Was it like that till the end?
So towards the end, we had 8 offices at the end, and we had about 60 staff. We couldn't manage teams plus do that kind of production work. I started seeing more of the higher end clients.
So again, why do you think other firms don't do this?
I think they forget to stop and ask the questions.
Because it's very efficient. Like the way you do it, like you get the returns done faster than if you create this assembly thing, like people drop off stuff and then you don't know
This is for the firms that are doing a lot of individual returns, just to clarify, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about individual returns for the most part.
Yeah. What was interesting also is that the business returns, as they started to become more and more complex, they needed to be prepped in advance. And then we would have those same types of conversations with them. And then we'd spend a fair bit of time while we were in person with folks actually talking about the individual return and the impact to that individual return. Because it's all starting in the businesses, but it's all impacting them individually. I used to love to say that we charge a lot of money for the business returns, but the personal returns are more difficult.
We don't charge enough for individual tax returns.
Yeah. The challenge is that the value perspective of the end customer was not as high on the personal side, even though the complexity was a lot higher there.
So why do you think that is?
I think as an industry, we undercut ourselves in that area. And I think as an industry, we end up commoditizing a little bit of that area. And that's where the biggest value is for any individual. That's where it's in their wallet. And to understand what's in that return is probably one of the more important pieces or times of your year to truly understand the impact of what you're doing the rest of the year. We had spent less time there, so we can spend more time thinking about what's the impact or running scenarios to look at what's the impact of this upcoming year. You can look proactively towards the future. Early on in my career, I never wanted to do anything commercially. I didn't want to deal with the business returns. I didn't want to deal with the business customers. And I hit a wall, this was 2014, where I was done. I was exhausted of the grind of going through another tax season. And it wasn't a matter that I didn't love the people that I was working with. That wasn't the problem. I loved all the clients that I had. The problem was I was tired of what I was doing. And I didn't see the personal value in what I was delivering when it was just another tax return. And
in your head, you were almost commoditizing it because it was just work.
Yeah, probably. So it was around that time where I remember waking up in the morning, getting in the car, driving to the office, and I was like, I don't want to do this now. And again, when I would get there, I would get into the rhythm, I would see my teams, and I would start working through the work of the day. The challenge was that I wasn't feeling rewarded by it. And that same time where we started to make a transition as to how we were working with clients, and it was discovering the ability to set up a new service line that really reinvigorated me. So around that time, I decided that I wanted to figure out another way of servicing clients.
What year was this?
So that journey started in 2013. We had decided that we wanted to start offering different types of services. But back then, to think about doing and paying people's bills was just something that everybody was afraid of. They didn't want the liability risk, or they didn't want to have access to the bank account, or they were worried about moving money, or we were worried about the customer not having enough money to do this, and they had cash flow problems. One of the things that was really eye-opening was we had the opportunity to see where technology was at that point, and these things were all possible, right? There was emerging technology that was able to help support some of these activities, and it just wasn't there before that. And I remember
2012 was the year.
Yeah. So I'll take you guys through what our early cloud journey looked like.
Sure.
And it's leading up to this really what I would call
the Doc Brown moment where you fell off the toilet bowl and hit your head and flux capacitor.
Yeah, my version was a little bit different because it involved a favorite watering hole in Philadelphia. But yeah, it's similar experience, similar result. So in 2009, Kevin and I were out in Kansas City for some conference, and we get on the plane to fly home, and we were servicing at that time probably about 250 payroll customers. We sit there and we pull out our yellow pad, and we start jotting down on this yellow piece of paper of how many different ways do we offer payroll. We ended up with 12 different ways on that page. And I was like, 12 different ways. This yellow piece of paper, we've got 12 different ways that we go to market with payroll. But the fact is we're probably doing it 250 different ways. And it was interesting to look at that yellow piece of paper and say, this is not a scalable process to be able to go and try and hire somebody to become some sort of payroll clerk for us and try and teach them all these nuances in all these different ways. And conceptually, why did that even make sense? So when we got off the plane, we pull out our yellow pad. When we got home, we said that we wanted to take it down in 3 different ways. We wanted an after the fact model, we wanted the full live model, and we wanted a hybrid model. If we could land on those 3 services, then we probably could get to the point where this was scalable enough so we could teach somebody else to do it. We brought it to a team in the office and said, hey, go find an online payroll solution provider. So they ended up landing on PayCycle. I don't know if you guys remember PayCycle. So they bought them.
Yep. One of their 20 different payroll options.
Yep, one of the 20. There is a second PayCycle payroll solution down in Australia that was actually purchased by Xero, so it's really confusing when you talk to people. But anyway, so the team went out there and they found this solution. We looked at it and said, yeah, it seems like it's in the right price range. And they were able to onboard themselves. They even onboarded our payroll into it. They had a login for the first few months. They did it all themselves. This was like the dull, fuzzy light bulb moment. But we realized that like the change management was any technology that came into that office, it was always a bumpy road. It was never consistent. It was never easy. It wasn't people just adopting it.
When you say that office, what's that office?
So it was the offices that we were running.
So one of those 8 offices, yeah.
It didn't matter what technology it was. It could have been a connected coffee maker. It still would have been a challenge. PayCycle made it pretty easy, and they were able to onboard, and they got 10% of the customers over to that platform pretty quickly and easily. They took it and ran with it, which was awesome. So if you jump forward to 2012, I remember being out with our soon-to-be Xero and ADP reps. They started telling us these stories about what firms are doing and how the larger firms are starting to innovate, and they're starting to use technology, and they're starting to add all these different service lines and start to add all these outsourced accounting solutions that they're building for their customers. And I was like, these guys are not any smarter than us. That was the big aha moment. Right. And whether or not those firms were really doing it at that point.
Definitely weren't doing it then.
It gave you hope, though. It gave you some balls.
Exactly. So at that point, Kevin and I made a conscious effort to say, okay, we're going to set aside some capital. We're going to hire an admin, and we're going to backfill some headcount. And I'm going to take a period of time to go and discover, what does the technology stacks look like? How does it all work? And how do we try and build process around it? And then how do we build a sales process around what we're trying to deliver? And that's where the fun really started. It took about a year until we were really had our spot where I felt pretty comfortable, where we could actually really start selling it hard.
So talk about your due diligence. Where'd you go? What'd you do? It sounds like you went like to Tibet and like did a hike and found yourself.
Nope, I did lots and lots of Google searching. So I was an app marketplace junkie. Right? I would look at all sorts of different apps to try and figure out how can they fit a void in the process that either a customer had. I tried to develop this outsourced solution for everybody. I just went blanket across the board. We can service everybody because we were generalists. Like we had a bunch of natural verticals or segments that we were supporting. Like we did a lot of, from a personal tax side, we serviced a lot of teachers and police officers and firemen and stuff like that. From a business side, I would say we were more focused on smaller businesses, and we were generalists. I went to our more innovative teams. And so I went to the staff and I was like, all right, who's going to need this? And they all said, nobody. I was like, that's bullshit. I was still using the ancient hammer method, which is, here, go figure it out.
Yep.
There's no way that's the case.
Nobody, meaning clients, would want to do it?
Yep. Let me go call them.
Why do you think they said that, though? Like, why would they come back with that as a bunch of people with the same opinion? I don't think they're right.
I think that was the easiest method for them.
They didn't want to do this.
They were not adopting.
I don't think they wanted to.
100%.
Because if they wanted to, Then the clients wanted to too, because you wanted to do it. Because
Well,
you will find clients to do that.
at that point, I had not learned the art of getting buy-in by the staff before you start deploying things.
Of course.
Yeah, yeah. So what was interesting was that when I talked about the hammer method, I never asked their opinion necessarily. I never explained why we were doing this or what we wanted to really accomplish and how that was going to benefit them, how it was going to benefit the clients, and then how it was eventually going to benefit Kevin and I.
You just saw the money. You were talking about the sales part was the funnest part. That's all you guys saw right then. At then, I'm not blaming you because that's shit I went through too.
Yeah. And that initial, pushback showed me that I had to bring them on the bandwagon.
So the sales reps got you pumped about how much more money you guys are going to make by doing this. Sales reps were irresponsible because they should have told you you're going to need your team's buy-in before you're going to be able to do this successfully.
Yes, we flew out to San Francisco. It was our first visit to the Xero office. So we show up in the Xero office, and our account manager's there, and she's helping us around, introducing us to people. And we walk into our first meeting with the then partner success manager. I'm sorry, partner consultant, whatever the title was back then.
It was not any of these new titles. I can tell you that.
Not any of the new titles, no.
Yeah.
And we sat down, and I had come up with a list of 5 or 6 industries that I wanted to target.
Oh, cool.
And so we sit down, and I'm like,
do you remember what those were?
No, I have no idea.
Really? So they must not have mattered. Yeah.
So I remember what one of them was, but when we looked at, so I sat down with them and I was like, all right, I want to go after these 6 industries. And they're like, no, you need to pick one. And I'm like, that's bullshit. Why do I have to go after one? And they're like, no, you really want to get really good at one first, then do another one. And it was probably some of the best advice I ever got, because here I was trying to go from 0 to 1 million overnight and never really taking.
No pun intended.
No pun intended, of course.
0 to 1 million, yeah.
And I wasn't taking the time to think about like how much work it was really going to be, because I saw the early wins with the technology, and that part seemed really cool and simple and easy. But I didn't realize what it was going to take to build out a full CFO type of offering with industry KPIs and demographics on the industry and benchmarking that we were able to do on our own amongst other clients. Like I'd never even thought of that. I was just like, oh, we're going to take on the world. No big deal. But in reality, every time I went to go build a new vertical, like that takes a significant amount of work. And it was probably some of the best advice I ever got was really just buckle down, get your processes figured out with your existing clients, but then go, if you're going to go focus on a specific niche or vertical, go deep and go really deep into it.
That's great advice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's...
So do you remember that one then?
What's that?
When they told you to go from 6 to 1, do you remember that one after you cut 5?
Yes, because it was not on the list.
Oh, wow.
So when I got home, and we had another stop on that trip, I remember, but when I got home, I actually sat down with our IT support person that was coming in to do something. And I remember talking to him, and he had just gotten back from a conference himself. And he was, yeah, I heard about Xero because he saw something on my desk or something. He's like, oh, I heard about Xero. Like I was just at this conference, I met this guy. He's got this app, integrates with Xero, I think. He's this is great. He's got, I think I want to jump in on it. And I was like, all right, we can help you with that. Knowing damn well that we had no idea what the hell we were going to do there. But it was interesting because the moment that he walked out the door, I picked up the phone and I called Kevin and I said, I know what vertical we're going to go into. And the reason why I knew that was I had a lot of passion for that industry, something that I was interested in. I probably would have gone down that path had I not stumbled into accounting or been tripped and pushed into accounting. And so it made sense. It was an area that I could assimilate with. I understood the people I was going to work with. I enjoyed working with those folks. And that was the first kind of verticalized step that we took. And he wasn't even a client at that time. He was using a friend of his that he grew up with, and he ended up leaving that friend to come work with us. So it was the start of a really good relationship. The other thing that we did was I immediately went and found that app ecosystem partner. I went and created a relationship with them. We were the US based support for them. So
the partners that they would push to, and you started getting clients from that partner.
Yep. So I would attend trade shows with them. We were marketing with them. Like, that's how we were aligned. And it was interesting because we did all their conversion and implementation work here in the US. And it was a very natural conversation. Oh, what work does your firm do? Well, we do everything. What else do you need? It was a really natural progression for us to develop deeper relationships with them.
That's awesome. I love that story.
So did your firm transition from heavy tax to outsourced accounting, and how did you make that switch?
Yeah. So we were never going to be 100% outsourced accounting. It just, we had too much invested in the tax space. We had too many tax clients that were driving a good chunk of the revenue. When we started, we were probably 80-20 tax to accounting. Once we got to the end, we were probably closer to 50. That was with a bunch of larger tax acquisitions as well. Because basically, when we would go in and we would buy a tax practice, we'd be looking for those golden nuggets that were sitting in there where we could actually expand the services and we could pull them into a more outsourced accounting service line. Yeah, so it ended up being closer to 50-50 at the end. And
is it like buying a collection of comic books just for the few that'll be like worth a ton of money?
Yeah, but the other ones were worth something.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we were thinking about the M&A work that we were doing, we were getting much more picky, but then the market was also a lot more open at that point. So we saw tax preparer registration go through and then get repealed. We saw a couple larger tax changes that were happening, or at least threatened, and then tax reform. It's a podcast, so you guys can't see the air quotes.
Whenever you repeat something, we assume that there's air quotes, us listeners.
Yeah, it made for more opportunities. As we had gotten bigger, it meant that we were going after larger size practices.
So how did you decide that it was time to sell your firm?
So in July of 2016, I started dedicating some of my time to Xero. So I became a national ambassador for Xero, which is basically a brand evangelist, if you will. Started doing a lot of speaking on behalf of Xero and traveling around a lot for Xero, probably in 2016, a little bit before that as well. And I just started to fall in love with working with accountants more than with my clients.
Because you had more in common with them?
I think so. In part it was that. In part it was, I saw an industry, and Scott, I think you said this earlier, I saw an industry that was ripe for change. And when I thought about where I wanted to make an impact, I was seeing a big impact from being an ambassador and being out telling the stories of what I'd gone through, and really just telling the story that I just went through, and starting to see people go out and do these things on their own. That just like filled me with validation that what I was doing was helping folks. And I'll never forget, like a year or so after, like the first time I spoke at an event where I was at another event, and somebody came up, and it was really humbling. I unfortunately didn't exactly remember who they were, but it was humbling in that this person just couldn't wait to come tell us what they had done, like how they had moved their transition and changed their practice in the past year, and what kind of successes they started seeing. I was like, wow, I'm helping my clients and I do enjoy doing this, but I wanted to get a little bit off the hamster wheel and think about where I could put value into the industry. And that started so I was a national ambassador for almost 3 years. And at that time, I was toying with the idea of leaving practice, because I think at that point I had been ready. I was ready for the next evolution in my career, and Xero was a really natural step for me. And I had a credit Ben Richmond for this one, because for about 6 months, Ben kept working on me. He's like, we can definitely find a spot for you here. There's definitely a spot in the sales team for you here. And I think for me, I was grappling with the fact that I wasn't sure if I was really or if I should be in a sales role. And when I looked back at it, I was like, what the hell was I doing all this time in practice? I was doing sales. And had I actually stayed in practice, like I would have had probably a sales team there. I would have been with SDRs and the whole structure. And I was actually pitching that to my partner at the time. And
what's an SDR?
Oh, an SDR, like a outbound salesperson.
Oh, okay. What does that mean?
It's like a cold caller, basically. I think what we probably like that would have all been built out in the practice. And could we have kicked that off and made some really good money doing it? Yeah, absolutely. But my passion had changed, my focus had changed, and I wanted to work with accountants instead of individual businesses.
So you mentioned the hamster wheel. You wanted to get out of that hamster wheel to help. It's like leaving the rat race almost to go actualize and realize your real potential.
Yeah, that's probably still yet to be determined, but I've been here for about 2 years now, so I guess it's starting to come to that point.
So for those of you like who never sold a tax practice or practice in general, like how did you go? I guess you've done a ton of mergers and acquisitions, but what's just the process of selling your practice?
Well, what did Kevin do? I didn't even hear anything about Kevin.
So Kevin actually stayed with the practice and continued to work in the practice. And we had some other businesses that we were involved with that he was focusing on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how'd you go about selling the practice?
Yeah. So so the first thing you gotta do is look at what do you have, right? What does the customer list look like? What's the demographics in there? What are the services that you've built out? What's the tenure of your staff? And what's their education and certification level? All of that stuff comes into the equation that a buyer or a seller is going to be thinking about. Personally, I think that you can command a higher valuation if your firm is more tech forward. So if you've taken on all the change management that a firm needs to go through, and you guys know this just as well as anybody else out there, that change management, it takes a while. It takes a while, it takes a lot of effort, it takes some repetition. Sometimes it takes a hammer. But I think that you can command a higher valuation once you've established that. And we've seen a bunch of firms that are in the market that, of course, we'll never truly disclose what they were bought for, but that are definitely bought at higher valuations. Now, what I've seen on the flip side of that is you have other areas of the world where firms are much more tech adoptive and have been for a long period of time. And some of the reasons behind that is they've had regulatory changes that force them into it. And what's interesting is we've seen, the more I get to talk to more of my counterparts in those regions, you're actually starting to see a downslope of valuations, right? So where here in the US, if you can get anywhere from 1 to 2x your gross receipts, they're starting to come down off that 1x gross receipts number, which means that
it made sense to me because they're becoming more commoditized. If you go all tech and you don't find that way to do the advisory piece and really connect with your clients, then you're just commoditizing yourself.
They can just wash away to whoever.
So that's very interesting that there's actual basis for that.
Oh yeah, it's supply and demand, right? If you can, the other thing is that there's more of those firms out there as well.
Yeah. So well, if everyone in Australia uses the same processes and everything is the same, then like
you've commoditized the firm. You've commoditized the products that you were building to.
But we're really far away from that in the U.S. I mean, very far.
Yeah, we are. We're light years away from that today. Could it get there at some point? Possibly. Is there a real threat of it today? No, because what it comes down to, and Jason, you just mentioned it, like it's about the relationships and the ability to have that conversation. Everybody gets concerned about the robots and what that is going to replace. What's going to replace is the work that none of us got into this industry to do. Nobody got into this, do journal entries or
look. Everybody who's embraced Xero, I think, sees that. I think it's the people that stick with QuickBooks or stick their head in the sand. Those are the ones who don't see that. But almost every guest that we've had on so far has been a change agent of some sort and is trying to change this industry that is just, there is just so much money and inertia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think if we look back in the last, let's say, 16 months now, where we've all been stuck in the spot that we're in, there's no more validation that you need than the ability to put things in the cloud. But that doesn't stop the conversations that people have to have with each other. Like, just because you can deliver virtually to somebody doesn't mean they understand it.
No. What do you do with the rest of that time? Do you try to cram more financial statements in, or do you try to cram more value in, or create space for more value and then charge that?
I think there's a balance there.
Yeah.
I think there's probably both.
Mm-hmm.
I think if your eyes are on the prize of larger scale, then there's definitely more of a balance of that. I think if your eyes on the prize of a higher per customer value, then you got to spend more time with them. So, quick story, with our business customers, we would have great conversations, like unbelievable conversations. And I'll never forget numerous customers saying, why can't we have these conversations throughout the year? And I was like, yeah, this is a great idea. This is awesome. When I started doing the outsource CFO work, it worked the same way as being in the office with them in this, little box that they could see on screen.
I love it. So let's move to Xero for a second.
Yeah.
So what do you think are we on the cusp of like more people in the US going to Xero? What do you think is holding Xero back in the US?
Let's rephrase that. It seems like a very leading question. Like, where is Xero at in the US right now? I don't even know.
Why don't you let him answer the question?
Yeah, I think
this is coming from two big Xero users. Obviously, like we're fully back Xero.
Yeah,
we want to see
those
more
numbers I
using
said earlier. It's like 97% of our clients combined are probably on Xero.
Is that for everybody? Oh, we can have that. We can take that conversation.
Yeah.
No, that's part of it. I'm just trying to keep it real. I'm just saying,
So,
like, I'm not doing that.
Oh yeah, and to think that a practice is going to be 100% on one product or another is that one's tough, right? There's always going to be incumbent or legacy products. It's what you do with the customer once you get them, and then how you command the selection of those apps. But anyway, so
yeah, we don't take clients on if they don't want to work in our system, because that just shows they are going to push back.
Yeah. Or it's not.
There's also certain things that Xero just isn't good for. And if you have a client, sometimes you don't use Xero for it.
Yeah, and it's something that we are fully well aware of, and
that's normal. Xero has its niche. But that wasn't the question. The question is like, how do we get more accounting firms using Xero? What do you think the biggest
the answer is not to fill in your feature gap. It's not that big a deal. You're saying you have to use QuickBooks for some clients. I'm trying to make a cool point here.
Well, you do. If you have a heavy inventory client, you can't go on Xero. Most likely.
You can, because they can use some other POS for inventory and then attach to Xero.
That's not the point. Xero's great for a bunch of different types of clients.
This was exactly what I expected from this conversation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You got it.
Yeah, I finally got it.
I would love to hear this.
I think the number one thing that we hear pretty consistently is brand recognition, right? Now, if I think back to 2012 to today, brand recognition's gone up significantly, right? There's not typically an event or, a conference that we would show up at where people didn't at least know or have had heard of us. And as soon as everybody started dropping the X from the end of our names, that was like the first win. But I think
stopped putting Z's.
Oh yeah, the Z too. Yeah, it's written all over my shirt.
Yeah, well, still they're.
By the way, I broke out the vintage shirt for you guys today.
I saw that and I respect it.
Those who may be listening to the podcast might not be able to see that. So
Well, we'll post it in the show notes. We'll post a link to a screenshot of this.
No, there are no pictures of us. Don't worry.
great. That's awesome. I'll have to rethink my engagement here. So I think that's the first part. I think the other part is that when you think about why some of the other competitors got so big, in part it was because the accountants didn't want to do the work. So early days, and I even remember this from when I was a little kid, right? Running around my dad's office. Like somebody would come in, they'd say, "Hey, I started a business this year. Cool, that's great. Go buy this thing off the shelf. Go run your checkbook through it. Bring it back to me at the end of the year." That was the kind of that was the quickest pathway to an electronic GL that we would get to. And the challenge was that as practitioners, we just didn't take the bulls by the horns there. We didn't have the time to deal with it, and so we pushed it off to Staples, where they had to go buy a box off the shelf. So when you fast forward now 20 years and you look at it and you're like,
remember when they used to sell QuickBooks Online on the shelf? I just love that they did that.
At Costco.
They might still do it.
They might, but I think those shelves are like in the back now. So we propagated our own problem as practitioners. So I think really that one of the biggest wins that we could have, number one, we've got to get SMBs that are using the product that'll drive the accountants. Like they can bring it in the door and say, "Hey, can you help me on this software?" Or have you used this software before? Or driving the practitioners that are not early adopters like yourselves that'll actually own that part of it and drive it back into the customer. But the other real win that we have where we really need to land is within the practitioner community, because the practitioners are whether or not they're doing intentionally or not, they are driving selection of applications. Even if it means that they're driving somebody to a website, they're still driving that selection. And we have to take responsibility for it.
A lot of them prefer to clean up QuickBooks than to clean up Xero. A lot of them prefer that.
They don't know Xero. But
they like to do journal entries. They don't know that you can just do a cash spend or something, and they know, oh, we can't post a journal entry to the cash account.
Yeah.
So from the sales perspective, like, what do you hear from the practitioners?
Wait, no, I want to hear what he's got to say about that, because that's something that my dad always used to say too. It was like, you should never, because he sells software, and you should never be able to post a journal entry to a bank account. That's just not something you should be able to do, and accountants love it.
Yeah, because it's easier to get it done that way.
Yeah, it's not right.
It's not right. We know it's not right. We know that there's only one person or institution that can actually post to a bank account, and that's the bank.
Or the client, and
or the client creating a transaction that gets pushed to a bank. But outside of that, it's not the accountant that's fixing a problem.
You're not going to make a journal entry to shareholders and some shit. I mean, that's...
But the challenge, so I think, Scott, you're right in saying that people are used to or enjoy cleaning up books in QuickBooks or whatever application it is. The challenge is that how do they actually break that paradigm and do it in a way that's full and complete? That's one thing that we started to stop when I was in practice, was no more of this year-end top-ending adjustments. Let's actually look into the data and see where the problem is, because we're just propagating a problem. We're not fixing anything.
You don't even know if the problem's there. Like, there might not be a problem, but there probably is if you're doing shit like that.
Yeah. And I think what it comes down to is, and I think this was the point you were making before, it's an education challenge. And it's a change management issue where people have to learn how to do something differently in a different way, and basically just walk in the door differently in a different application. The fact is, these are all debits and credits, right? It's still the same basic accounting formula. None of that stuff's changed.
What's Xero's strategy then to get people to see that?
So in part, it's what I experienced when I first came to Xero as a practitioner. It was really spending as much time with the accounting partners that are out there as possible, and spending time up front, educating and hand-holding to the best of their ability, consistently and ongoing. I think that's where Xero's always, that's where they won. That's where they won the hearts and minds.
So going back, like, why did you pick Xero originally over QuickBooks?
So it tracks back to what I just said. It was the only area that I'd ever had a vendee relationship where who I was buying from actually cared about my success.
Yeah, that's what I say. I always see that.
Sponsor this pod soon. I'm really excited about it.
What's that?
Xero's going to be a sponsor of this pod soon. You don't know it. Xero doesn't know it yet, but they will.
I don't care if it's QuickBooks or Xero. One's green, one's blue. Honestly, I don't care. I'm not passionately against QuickBooks. And a lot of us see the same things and the same trends because we're outside of that bubble. I hope that we haven't created our own bubble that we're in. And I'm trying to make sure I see everything outside of it. And I think that's your job. You have to do that shit because you're competing against it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's about how people show up, and think about it in respect to how you guys service your own clients. They're not going to stay with you if you don't put in the effort and you don't love on them. And I think this is what we were talking about before in part, even with the volume that I was doing when I was earlier in practice, and even that individual contributor type of mindset, those conversations I was having with people and the stuff I was able to remember about them from the prior year, that's the relationships that were solidified. It's not any different when you're selling a product to somebody. It's the same thing. You have to.
It's almost even more important. Like Dave, I said this last week about something different, but I'm going to say it again. If you're not giving them a reason to stay, you're giving them a reason to leave.
Did he really?
Just a sigh, deep sigh.
Damn, man, that is the last time I say that.
Yeah, I do think that is one cool thing about Xero is you do really care about the advisor, that's what led. That was a big reason why we decided to go 100%. To Xero.
Yeah.
So tell us a few things that you're excited about, maybe some new features that are coming out for Xero.
You sell to other firms the features or the benefits?
We always lead with people.
What are the benefits of using Xero?
Yeah, but that's not how accountants think.
That is definitively not how accountants think.
So you can't, if you try to sell that, that's...
Yeah.
I've seen it in our firm, the way we got Xero buy-in, we didn't drop the hammer. I was like, this is Xero. I'm going to start using it on my clients. This is why it's going to save you time and why it's good. And eventually everyone in the firm bought into it but it was the features. If Xero sucks, like, you can have the best rep of all time. Like, we have ADP reps that come all the time. Fucking sucks.
All right, I'm taking it for granted. I'm sorry. I totally take for granted that Xero is at least good enough that it competes with QuickBooks.
So what I can say is that the U.S. market, who has not always been the number one focus for our product team, is now the number one focus. So you'll start to see product gaps that are starting to get filled here in quick succession. So even since January, one of the areas that we've always had a bit of a challenge around was around bank feeds. So we went out and now have most all of the major banks that have actual direct bank feeds that we built.
I love it.
Yeah, and I'm jealous because when I was in practice, I would have loved having that. But in reality, that's a major win in the US market. And then there's other things that are coming within the next 12 months that you guys will see.
You can tell us off air some of them. We won't publish them.
Oh, yeah. I have an NDA anyway. We both have NDAs.
What's the best thing you like about working at Xero?
It's still the people. Like, there was probably a little bit of FOMO, if I have to be totally honest, when I was working in practice and I was watching the folks that worked at Xero. There was a little bit of FOMO about what would it be like to work at a tech company? What would it feel like to be in that startup type of mentality all the time? And I think that's still true. Like, it's still true on the other side. I get excited about waking up to go to work. Like, I don't mind working super late.
It's not still true then. You don't have FOMO of looking at us, at our firms? You don't miss that shit too? Come on, dude.
I definitely want to hear what's going on and actually get to hear a lot more about what's going on.
Oh, true. Yeah.
But I got to admit, my favorite tax season was my first one at Xero.
So, final question. Do you ever see yourself getting back into practice, into public practice?
I think that there could be a day that I get back to public.
Oh, he's leaving the door open, baby. There we go.
Got some FOMO. It's FOMO Dave. That's your nickname. FOMO Dave. That's what we're gonna put on the show notes. Featuring FOMO Dave.
It could happen one day. I don't know that would be my next stop necessarily, but I still got another. If history repeats itself, still have another 16 years at Xero.
Well,
so
if Xero becomes a giant accounting firm too, then yeah.
That I don't see happening.
All right, Dave.
The
this
robots
has been amazing.
are the
You
employees.
spent more than enough time with us, and honestly, you're stupider for it.
But we're smarter for it.
Yeah, exactly. We appreciate
Siphoned off of it. Dave. We siphoned it. That's what's in this hint right there. A little hint of Dave.
A hint of Dave. Dave, thank you.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Beautiful.